Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. The Broadband Bunch Zero Touch Learning Series is live. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Craig Corbin. Today's session, Funding New Networks in the Era of Social Distancing, is the fourth in our series. We've had some phenomenal discussions to this point, and we've got a couple more on the calendar in the month of July. Early on, we took a look at distance learning, telemedicine, and most recently, life post-COVID-19. Coming up in July on the 7th, it will be, yes, fiber networks are still being built. And on the 21st, integrations in telecom, what drives success? The Broadband Bunch podcasts and Zero Touch Learning Series brought to you as always by ETI Software, proud member of the Fiber Broadband Association. And be sure to follow the Broadband Bunch on Facebook at www.com/the Broadband Bunch. A couple of quick reminders before we introduce our esteemed panel today. The session is most definitely interactive. We encourage you to submit questions via the chat function. Our team will be monitoring that throughout today's event. And the session is being recorded and will be available to all attendees for future access. Also, please feel free to submit potential topics for future Zero Touch Learning Series sessions, or if you want to suggest any prospective panelists. Again, you can do that via the chat function. We thank you in advance for your participation. Today's topic, extremely important, very timely, and certainly given the unprecedented challenges we're all facing. We have a great panel standing by, introducing them in just a second, but first, a privilege to introduce our moderator. A 30-year veteran of the communications industry, Heather Gold is CEO of HBG Strategy and previously served as president and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Following her tenure as Senior Vice President of External Affairs and Access Management for EXO Communications. She graduated magna cum laude from Tufts University with BA and MA degrees in economics, and then earned an MBA in finance and marketing from Washington University in St. Louis. Our moderator for funding new networks in the era of social distancing, Heather Gold. Heather?
Thanks, Craig. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. As we heard during our first two virtual learning sessions, now more than ever, rural areas need fiber to the home. The challenges of the pandemic, distant learning, and the need for more telehealth have only exacerbated the economic disparities that previously existed in limiting rural Americans' participation in our global economy through their slow internet. But how do we get more investment, and what will it cost? We have seen a rural provider in Maine and Alabama, Otelco, estimates that a cost of a fiber build is roughly $20,000 per mile for the infrastructure, and then $6 per home to deliver the service. If you have an average of 13 homes per mile, which is getting very rural, the cost for the provider to deliver that service is $32 a month, where the subscriber pays $65. So you get a profit of $33. So if you look at a 1 mile build with 13 homes, the total project would be about $21.40 per home. But that assumes every home takes service. What if only 7 homes took service? That would increase the cost to build to $34.60. By dividing the cost per home over the net revenue, you'll see it takes nearly 9 years for a provider to break even on the investment. And compare this to an urban environment where a provider has hundreds of homes in a one mile area. You can see why the investment case is different and very challenging. And not every provider can wait 9 years, especially those owned by large public entities. So how do we provide the necessary funding for rural areas? And to whom does the funding get directed? An increasing question among funding entities is whether to continue to direct fund to carriers, which is the historical standard feature of federal universal service, or to begin directing monies directly through communities. as do many of the new state broadband programs and some of the new RUS fundings, a model which allows communities to pick the providers they would like to bid with. Today's speakers are experts in this funding arena and in the process for getting that funding. Carol Maddie is the principal of Maddie Consulting based in Washington, D.C. She provides regulatory, strategic, and public policy advisory services to broadband providers, government, nonprofit organizations, and others active in the telecom space. She has more than 30 years experience formulating, enforcing, and advising on federal communications regulation. Prior to launching her own firm, Maddie was the Deputy General of the Wireline Competition Bureau, where she spent 7 years focusing on modernizing the FCC's Universal Service Fund into the creation and implementation of the Connect America Fund, which directs more funding towards broadband deployment. Joanne Hovis is president of CTC and a nationally recognized authority on broadband markets and on the evolving role of public and private partnerships in the provision of communication services to the public. For more than 30 years, she has overseen and directed CTC's consulting services relating to strategic planning, market analysis, business modeling, and financial analysis for localities, states, and tribal governments throughout the country. She also serves as a CEO for the Coalition of Local Internet Choice and as a member of the board of directors for the Benton Institute, Consumer Reports, and the Fiber Broadband Association. And with that, I am turning the discussion over to Carol Maddie, or to Joanne first, on the various and vast sundry array of options we have for funding. Joanne?
Thank you, Heather. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. An honor to be on a panel with Carol, and my thanks to Heather and everyone at ETI for making this possible. I am going to talk fast and briefly and give you all a sense of the overview of the particularly grant programs that are available to you as you think about how to build or extend your infrastructure and what kinds of options you will have. I'm going to talk about existing and very concrete options that exist at the moment, but also about things that come around periodically and things that we are speculating knowledgeably, I would say, might be coming in the relative near future. I'm not going to touch on the FCC's Rural Digital Opportunities Fund because Carol is one of the world's experts on that program, and I know she's going to talk about it in some detail. So instead, what I'll talk about is state and federal grant programs, and I'll just mention with regard to the Rural Digital Opportunities Fund, that you should all think about that program as something that can be layered with other opportunities. Depending on the terms of what you build, the terms of the programs under which you build, if you do get funding, you hopefully would not be restricted from utilizing more than one of these funding programs. And indeed, the economics of your network may be greatly improved by using more than one and thinking of these in a layered way. You should also know that there are a pretty substantial number of programs out there that I haven't touched on here just for lack of time, but there are Transportation Department, Homeland Security, and related programs that fund infrastructure, including communications infrastructure. If you are a public entity and you're thinking about how to do this, those are federal programs that you should look at as well and consider how they fit into a broader strategy. And finally, just while we're talking overview and big picture, there was a pretty important announcement out of Washington this morning that is the result of quite a bit of buzz that has been spreading over the past few weeks about a major announcement coming from the president regarding a potential bill for infrastructure, of which broadband infrastructure, particularly in rural areas, would be a significant component. My understanding also is that just as of an hour or so ago, there was an announcement that the president's going to do some kind of event or speech about rural broadband. I think that it's a long way from that to a bill that is passed by both houses of Congress and signed by the president, but there is something that is coming. This is in the air. If it does not happen in the next few weeks, I feel reasonably confident we will see it in the next 9 months, whatever the results of the election. So plan now, think now, prepare now for the fact that there might be substantial new funding available in coming months. And the best way to leverage it then is to get ready now. Can I have the next slide, please? So the starting point for this analysis should always be what your state has. And we are in a brave new world when it comes to state broadband funding opportunities. Even just 5 years ago, I could count on one hand the number of states that had grant programs for significant broadband infrastructure. And today it is the great majority. And frankly, I think had the coronavirus crisis, the economic crisis and the healthcare crisis not interrupted the state legislative session that began at the beginning of the year, we might be at 40 or more states that have grant programs. The economic challenges we currently face may slow down the growth of these programs, but the level of concern, interest, and commitment by state legislatures and governors is at its all-time highest. These are important programs to consider because in my experience, they tend to be more flexible, less restrictive, and much more useful in a variety of ways than the federal programs. They tend to be smaller in total dollars, but very flexible and obviously very focused on local communities and the partnerships between local communities and private entities. And to give you a sense of the scale of what is possible here, as I said, 5 years ago, there were a handful of state programs. Most of them were applying a few $1 million a year to rural broadband. The state of Illinois now has a program that is $420 million over a few years, a remarkable number on a per capita basis, and obviously a step function increase in growth over previous numbers. I think that is the flavor of the future, at least once we hopefully return to some kind of economic normality. Can I have the next slide, please? So the next thing, as we turn to look at the federal government, let me share with you that there are a handful of agencies that you should be very focused on. And the FCC is obviously one of them. The Department of Agriculture is another one, as that is a traditional location for broadband grants. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the US Department of Commerce is a third that you should be very aware of as well. EDA is the Economic Development Administration of the Department of Commerce, and it is an entity that is charged with investing, well, it's charged with many things, but one of those things is investing federal funds for economic opportunity and to have economic impact. The opportunity that exists right now, and if you are interested, the time to act is really quickly. This opportunity is CARES Act funding of just under $1.5 billion that was appropriated by Congress in the CARES Act and that EDA is getting ready to give out right now. They are accepting applications already, and they will make awards of successful and viable and meritorious applications until they run out of money. So my sense is that an application that is written and filed later than late summer is probably going to be too late. But if you have a project ready to go, or even just a project concept, this is something worth looking at right away. EDA has determined that the entire country is eligible from the standpoint of economic suffering. And what that means is that it'll make awards based on economic impact. It's already established that everyone has economic suffering and therefore eligibility. And the economic impact that we'll be focused on is, will this allow for COVID-19 recovery? Will it allow for the creation of jobs or the retention of jobs? And those two things are equally important, by the way, creation or retention, and retention. The The grant application process itself is not particularly burdensome. It's relatively efficient. It's a very reasonable process. EDA has regional representatives who are tasked with communicating with the potential grantees and giving them feedback on their grant applications, which is a remarkable support and assistance for a grant program. And the final thing I'll say on this is, because I don't want to spend too much time on it, we want to get to everything else, but the key thing to know about this program is that the awardees, the applicants, have to be either public sector or not-for-profit or universities. That these are not grants that are available to for-profit entities, but they are absolutely available for public-private partnerships. And I have worked on many with EDA over the years and in the current moment where there is an effort by a public entity to build out infrastructure to make it available to private entities through public-private partnership and to create the opportunity for private entities to provide services in those areas. One final thought. Because the entire country is eligible, this is not just a rural grant program. It's an economic development grant program, and the kind of standard metrics around what is served, what is unserved, and the way that the FCC and USDA tend to think about broadband, not really relevant here. It's just about where can this infrastructure fill gaps to create new economic opportunity. Can I have the next slide, please? The other thing to know about EDA is that even though it has this $1.5 billion under the CARES Act, that is not the only opportunity. EDA administers an annual program of about $200 million a year. Broadband projects are explicitly eligible, and indeed they have funded broadband projects as well as lots of other projects, as they are doing with their CARES Act money. It's a more burdensome process. The rules are a little bit different. It looks somewhat different to the CARES Act funds, which are designed to get out as fast as possible. But you should know that even if your application under the CARES Act funding is not successful or is not in time, you have another bite at the apple next year and presumably the year after and the year after that, because, and in fact, starting this fall, because EDA has an annual appropriation and this is an existing grant program. Can I have the next slide, please? A program that I think many of you will know about and that is particularly important and encouraging is USDA's Reconnect program, which was created by Congress 2 years ago and has been funded for 2 years. The second year grant applications are currently in review by USDA, and round 3, which would presumably be for 2021, has not yet seen an appropriation from Congress, but it's generally expected that because this program has broad bipartisan support to fund rural broadband, that there will be a new appropriation for a subsequent year and hopefully multiple subsequent years. In my view, by the way, this is an excellent grant program and USDA's administration of it has really been exceptional and exemplary. One of the things I will be looking for in this presentation that the President's going to make and in the administration's broadband bill, as well as in the response that Congress has, I will be looking for whether they are looking at funding Reconnect going forward and hopefully in much larger dollars. Just a few highlights of this program and why I think it is well worth monitoring it and potentially even asking your congressional delegation to pay attention to it, to support it, and to fund it. Among the highlights of this program are the fact that USDA, as a very experienced broadband grant maker, really understands rural communities. It does not rely on the FCC's broadband maps, which I think we all know are imperfect, to put it kindly, but USDA allows the applicant to present a case for why an area is not served with broadband and why that area should be funded, and to draw the boundaries of that area in a creative way rather than by census block. The value of that from the standpoint of an applicant is much greater flexibility. And yeah, please go ahead. The next slide was good. I forgot to ask you for it. I won't go into too much detail about the restrictions of what is considered eligible and what is not. They are somewhat restrictive rules, but even with these restrictive rules, an applicant can draw on a map the areas that are unserved, including if there are multiple contiguous, non-contiguous unserved areas, and file an application for the aggregate of those multiple areas. This means that for a project where you might want to do some fill-in to areas that were not economical to build during an earlier build out where the density was just not sufficient, this could be a very interesting project to aggregate multiple unserved areas into a single application. If you are a community that does not want to apply yourself but is working with a private partner, this could be a really interesting strategy as well, because you can try to encourage your private partner to fill those gaps that your community has identified where there are unserved pockets within larger contiguous areas that are served, and try to meet the needs of those households and businesses in those unserved areas. So a very positive program from that standpoint. Can I have the next slide, please? Also at USDA is the Community Connect program, which is an established and really successful but modestly sized program that is focused on communities, primarily lower income communities, but not exclusively, where there is critical need for broadband. The eligibility for this program, like Reconnect, is very broad. It's public sector, nonprofit, and for-profit, but it's very focused on how are the broader needs of the community going to be met, including to community anchor institutions, and for providing access to computers at some of those anchor institutions. This is a program that usually USDA opens the grant window in the early spring and closes it in the late spring. That has not yet happened this year, I think in part because this has not been a typical year in any sense. But keep an eye out for this program because it's not enormous, but it's very powerful. And I've seen some very creative applications funded, very worthy applications that have been very successful over time as well. Can I have the next slide, please? Finally, at USDA, distance learning and telemedicine. This is a program that will fund connectivity, but is primarily focused on equipment. If you are, as so many of us are in this COVID-19 era, dealing with needs for distance learning and telemedicine in a wide range of different circumstances, this is a really accessible grant program that can provide funding to buy equipment and other kinds of support. Congress added an additional $25 million to the standard appropriation for this funding in the CARES Act, and those applications are due July 13th. It is a very non-burdensome grant application process. It's very simple to fill out the application. And I don't know about the CARES Act funds. I don't know how much competition there will be for those funds this year, but in previous years, the success rate for grant applications under this program have been close to 70%. And at 70%, it really behooves you to consider whether you want to apply for this or not if you have an eligible project. Can I have the next slide, please? I won't go into a whole lot more detail here, other than to say that, well, lots more in the deck, and you're welcome to peruse it at your time so that I'm not eating into Carol's time. And the next one, please. I will make this my last slide because I think I've gone through my fair share of time so far, but you should all know also that while we're talking about the healthcare need of COVID-19, there's a substantial amount of funding that went to the FCC from the CARES Act that is designed to provide support to healthcare entities for various kinds of connectivity and other matters related to telehealth. The funding, by the way, can pay for things that have funds that have already been expenditures going back to mid-March when the COVID-19 shutdown started. If you are a public health entity or a hospital or a rural healthcare facility or a nursing home, or you are a service provider who serves any of those kinds of entities, you should know this program is out there. There are still funds available, and the FCC will continue giving them out until they are expended. It's another one of these very low burden, but very potentially meaningful programs that are out there and available in the current moment where you have to move relatively fast. And I will stop there. There are lots of other programs, but hopefully that gives you a flavor for some of what is out there right now. I'll just say final thought. I'm optimistic that Congress and the administration will get this right, and we'll be looking at very substantial new broadband funding in the coming year, and we should all just stay attuned to that.
Thanks, Joanne. Carol.
Well, thank you. So next slide, and you can go on to the next one as well. I'm going to do a deep dive, actually go back one, a deep dive on the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, which is the FCC's program to fund broadband. It's the successor program to the Connect America Fund. And I'm going to talk about the basic program rules, the application process, and then conclude with a few thoughts about considerations people should be evaluating whether or not they want to pursue that funding. So with the next slide, as I said, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, or RDOF as we often call it, is a program that basically carries forward the FCC's original vision to award funding on a competitive basis. The FCC did a dramatic overhaul of its old historical universal service program back in 2011. And the first phase of that was to provide funding, an offer of funding to the largest telecom carriers to deploy 10-1 broadband to a discrete number of locations. But the vision always was that at the end of that discrete period of time, then the funding would be opened up on a competitive basis. So in this program now, the FCC is going to be making funding available in areas that lack 25.3, and it does use those imperfect maps that Joanne referred to, but it's focusing on the areas that are completely unserved. It plans to hold two separate auctions. The phase one auction will be focused on the completely unserved areas, and then subsequently, after the FCC improves the maps, there will be a second phase two of the RDOF, which will focus on the areas that are partially served census blocks. The funding is targeted to census blocks. The program is open to any entity that can meet the requirement and deliver the varying levels of broadband service that the FCC allows recipients to provide. The funding is very different than a grant program. Effectively, a grant program typically it's a discrete amount of money, and maybe it gets paid a little bit up front, and then half of it at an intermediate milestone, and then the rest upon completion of the project. Often based on project costs. The FCC's program is completely different. It's a steady stream of funding that is literally paid monthly over a 10-year time period. The precise amount of funding is determined through a competitive auction, which I'll discuss further in the presentation. But at the end of the day, it's not the kind of program where you have an elaborate application and you have to sort of meet certain scoring criteria and you get extra points for serving different kinds of institutions or businesses or whatever. I mean, this program, the amount of money you get is literally determined through an auction. So if you want to go to the next slide, it's really important to understand what the obligations are for this program. It is the, carrying out of the FCC's historical universal service program for voice service. And Recipients of the funding are obligated to provide both voice and broadband to all homes and small businesses in whatever the funded area is on a defined timetable. Basically, companies have 6 years to complete their deployment with interim milestones along the way. One of the most important things people need to be aware of to be part of this program, entities have to be designated what's called an eligible telecommunications carrier. And that is a statutory requirement under federal law. It's not a barrier or discretionary thing that the FCC has erected, but rather that's part of the 1996 Act. In most circumstances, entities are designated an ETC by the State Public Utility Commission, except in limited circumstances. Some states don't have jurisdiction over particular kinds of providers. And in those situations, then the entity seeks ETC designation at the FCC. You don't have to be an ETC at the time you apply for the program. You can wait and see if you're a winning bidder, but it is something that must be completed before the FCC will actually authorize funding. Another requirement is that recipients of the support have to get what is known as a letter of credit from a bank that's acceptable to the FCC, which effectively is securing the amount of funding that the FCC has advanced to you over time. And then when you complete the deployment, then you can shut down the letter of credit. Again, I don't have time to get into all the details. There are extensive reporting and compliance requirements. As you complete your deployment, you have to report the geocodes of the locations that newly have available service, not that they have a subscriber, but that service is being offered through the FCC's fund administrator, which is the Universal Service Administrative Company. Companies that participate in the program also have to do quarterly testing of the speed and latency of their service and also report those results to USAC. So now, next slide. The basic application process is a two-part application process. The first part is to apply to bid in the auction, and that is known as the short form application. And then the auction occurs, which determines who are the winning bidders. And then the winning bidders file a second application, which is called the long form application. So right now, the FCC has adopted all of the basic, all of the rules and requirements for this program. It has announced the schedule. The short form application window will open on July 1st and it will close on July 15th. The FCC previously put out a map of preliminary areas that are eligible, and that's the map you can see on the right of the slide. Sometime before July 15th, the FCC will be releasing an updated map that will take into account and resolve some challenges that were made to the eligibility of certain areas. The bidding in the auction will start on October 29th. Given the size of this auction and the scope, I expect the bidding will last for several weeks, probably a month or so. And so that means as a practical matter that the long form applications probably won't be due until January. And based on past experience with the last auction that the FCC held, the first applicants were authorized to receive funding about 6 months after the end of bidding. So realistically, the earliest that actual dollars would be flowing out the door would likely be in the summer of 2021. So now in terms of the application process, as I said, the first step is this short form application. In that application, people are basically notifying the FCC of a variety of things. They say what state they're interested in bidding on, what level of service, what level of broadband service they're proposing to offer. When they notify the FCC of the state, they're not saying where exactly in the state, but just I want to bid on this particular state. The applicants have to provide basic operational information and financial information. The FCC has sort of a two-track system. Any entity that has 2 years of operational history providing either voice, broadband, or electric service, that's sort of the first track, which I think of as the easier track. In that case, the entity, reports that it has been in business, has been offering service for 2 years, and provides audited financials if it's normally audited. If it's not audited in the normal course of business, the entity has to commit to submitting audited financials in the long form process. For any entity that does not have those 2 years of operational history, they have to provide 3 years of audited financial statements and a commitment letter from a bank saying that they would be willing to commit a letter of credit. So that's a bit more onerous process. And then, the FCC staff reviews this basic information, and basically the point of it is to determine whether this entity seems reasonably qualified to bid, but it's not a deep dive. Then on the back end, on that long form application, that's when after the applicant, knows where it's the winning bidder, then the applicant has to provide significantly more information, specifically, their network engineering plan, which has to be certified by a professional engineer. The applicant has to provide a detailed project budget, has to show, that it has funds available to cover costs that are not going to be covered by the RDOF for the first 2 years, and make various certifications and so forth. Now, if you bid in this auction and win, you are expected to perform. There actually is a process called default bids where the FCC will assess a penalty if you bid and then you fail to file that long form application. So, next slide, please. For anybody that's thinking about this program, all I can say is you better get going. Time is running out. The applications are due in less than a month. You really need to be thinking about where you want to bid. You need to be developing your business plan. As I said, you don't have to submit that business plan to the FCC as part of that initial application process, but you are required to certify that you've done due diligence and you understand, the program and the requirements and what you're expected to do. And you need to understand what is the maximum amount of funding that's available. The FCC has released spreadsheets associated with those eligible areas that shows a figure. And the thing that's really important for folks to understand is that is the maximum amount of dollars that would be available in the auction. And in all likelihood, that amount could be bid down. So you need to develop internally what your bottom line number is so that you can prepare to participate in the auction in an effective way. The minimum biddable unit is a census block group, which is a collection of census blocks. One of the things you need to decide, not only are you bidding on a specific census block group, but you also can decide whether you want to package them together. And last but not least, the thing that is the most important thing you need to be figuring out in the next couple of weeks is, are you bidding solo or are you bidding as part of a group? The FCC has a rule that prohibits applicants from communicating with each other about bids or bidding strategy after those short form applications are due. Applicants are required to identify agreements in their short form application. And so to the extent that you are thinking about any kind of partnership, consortium, or whatever, you have to figure that out now. So now let's move on to the next slide. Okay, these are the performance tiers. I'm hearing an echo. Are you hearing an echo? Yeah. Okay. Okay, well, I don't know why that's happening, but these are the 4 performance tiers that are the options for how you can offer service in the auction, and for each performance tier, applicants have the option of bidding in either high or low latency service. High latency service would be, primarily, geostationary satellite companies like Viasat and Hughes. The way this bidding works is entities that are proposing to offer different levels of service are all competing with one another in the auction. The FCC has assigned what are called weights, which are the numbers on the far right side, which the way to think about it is the weights are a way to sort of handicap from the FCC's perspective the relative value of the different kinds of service. In this case, a low weight, like the number 0, is good. That means that a bidder that is bidding in the gigabit tier for low latency service, that entity will, at each round of the auction, will be getting whatever the price is at that round of the auction. And as I'll explain in a minute, for entities that are bidding slower service or high latency service, those weights serve mathematically to reduce the actual dollars that they would receive at any given round. So we can go to the next slide. So the competition is going on not just for particular geographic areas, but it is a nationwide competition for this. The FCC has established the budget of 1.6 billion annually, which is 16 billion over the 10-year term for the phase 1 auction. The sum of the quote reserve prices, which is the maximum amount of money that's available, is about 2.9 billion, which is 29 billion. So think of it as sort of the sum of the dollars associated with the entire country are twice as big as the budget. And so the competition, the whole point of the competition is to get bidders to reveal their price of what they're willing to accept, and competition will drive the price down. Now, as I said, the slower speed services effectively in the auction, their actual dollars they receive are reduced. But so, big picture, when the auction starts, a bidder in Massachusetts is bidding against a bidder in New Mexico and a bidder in Washington State. So you shouldn't be thinking of this as, well, nobody else wants to serve this area, I'm going to win, because big picture, you all are bidding for this limited amount of the budget. And in each round, it's a descending auction. So the price starts high and goes low. And for each round, you can kind of think of it as the system is basically saying, at this price, are you still in? And you basically say, yes, I'm in, or you drop out. When competition in the auction drives down the collective sum of the bids nationwide, so that collectively they all sum up to be the budget, that's called the clearing round. And then that's the point at which the FCC starts to declare winners. In any area where there's only one bidder, any particular geographic unit, that bidder will win in the clearing round. In the clearing round, if there are 2 or more bidders, what happens depends on what speed tier and what weights they have associated and what price point. The FCC has adopted a rule that in the clearing round, when you have 2 or more entities bidding at what's called the base clock percentage, and that's basically, think of it as 100, 90, 80, 60, whatever, it's sort of, each round you're bidding like between 90 and 100% of the dollars, and then the next round is between 80 and 90% of the dollars. So in the round that's the clearing round, if you've got 2 bidders that are both at that minimum number, whichever one has the lower weight will win. And what this means as a practical matter is that the FCC has provided an advantage to gigabit bidders. If a gigabit bidder is bidding against a slower speed service in the clearing round and properly places its bid at the bottom of the range, it will win. Now, if you have 2 bidders that are at the same weight, then bidding will continue in subsequent rounds for that geographic area until one of them drops out and the other one is the winner. But big picture, the FCC has designed this auction in a way that is exhibiting a preference for gigabit low latency service. So I think that's basically it about bidding. Oh, one thing I should mention. In the last auction, people obviously look at, the past auction to get a sense of what might happen. In the last auction, the clearing around occurred in the 12th round, which was the range of price being between 70 and 79.99%. The actual clearing price point, I think, was like 78% 78% or something like that. I caution everyone that this auction is going to be significantly different than the last one, and you should not assume that what happened last time will happen this time. I can tell you right now, there's a lot more competitive interest in this auction. You know, the last auction that the FCC held 2 years ago was for a more limited geographic territories. It was really the first big auction that the FCC had ever done, and I think a lot of entities have, you know, looked and saw, oh wow, somebody bid in that auction and they won, and there's a lot more interest in this auction. In the last auction, the incumbents that were currently receiving money in these areas weren't really major bidders. The calculus for this auction could be entirely different. So it's really hard to look in the crystal ball and figure how this is all going to play out. So to turn to my last slide, which is, you know, sort of strategic considerations and how you should figure out, you know, whether you want to do this or not. You know, some people may have already decided, and probably everything I've said you already know. But if you're still considering it, I think it's really important to understand that, you know, the FCC genuinely wants to see competitive entry into these markets. It's tried to create a process that has relatively speaking, lower barriers to bid in the auction with a more, you know, more in-depth application process on the back end. You know, this at the moment is the largest federal government funding program. Obviously, we're all, you know, waiting, and I'll be very interested to see, you know, the announcement that Joanne, you know, alluded to. You know, there may be more money coming down the road, but certainly this is a not insignificant amount of money that is going to be happening this year. Like it's going to happen. It is known, it is certain, and it is definite. You need to ask yourself, if I don't bid, who else will bid? And consider, you know, what the ramifications are, you know, particularly for entities that may be adjacent or near an area that's eligible. You know, you have to decide, am I going to edge out and move into that area or risk the consequences of somebody else? Now, the program, as I said, it is not, they don't provide the money up front. You still have to get access to financing and, you know, other sources, you know, potentially to actually complete the deployment, but you can, you know, it's certainly much easier to get a loan. And indeed, RDOF in the Reconnect program has been providing loans to entities that won in the last auction because they have the assurance that the revenues will be coming in over that time period to pay back the loan. So, you know, simple, you know, no simple answer as to whether it's right for you, but it is definitely something that everybody should be considering at this time. And with that, I will stop.
Well, thank you both so much. We have time for questions. If you want to fill in a question on your chat line, I'm going to launch into some questions I have for these experts. But again, we're looking to see if you all have questions coming in. The first one I wanted to ask both of you, and I think Carol alluded to this slightly, is with the pandemic and with the and as you said, there's a lot more interest in the RDOF this time. Have both of you seen an increase in business? I mean, are you guys still, are you one of the few groups that is doing well under this pandemic scenario because people are so interested in getting fiber funding for their community?
I mean, I can say business is really booming. And I can compare this to, you know, when I think back to the spring of 2018, like the number of phone calls and referrals I'm getting related to RDOF compared to where we were in spring of 18 for the CAF Phase 2 auction, it's noticeably higher, which is why I'm predicting there's going to be a lot more interest in this auction.
Joanne, have you seen your interest step up in your area?
Yes, definitely. What I will say though is that I'm not sure it's that there are more folks out there trying to build fiber networks or wireless networks or anything else. I don't know that the pandemic has increased that, but I do think that we happen to be in a moment where there are a lot of different funding programs available. The pandemic and the RDOF timing are kind of perfect to each other, although that wasn't intentional. But the CARES Act funding that has created new broadband funding opportunities was intentional, but obviously comes from RDOF and, comes from the pandemic. And so that has raised a lot of interest because entities that wouldn't otherwise be thinking about this are now thinking, here's an opportunity where we can start to fill gaps. So that funding, I think, is working as it was intended to create economic activity. I'm happy to say that's certainly a good thing for my company. We're plenty busy writing grant applications. But I don't know that I would say that there's an escalation in interest in building new fiber networks that's noticeable just because of the pandemic. Although over time, there's no question that will be the case. Because policymakers at every level of government are much more concerned today about lack of broadband affordability than they were 3 months ago. Now, they should have been concerned before. They were somewhat concerned. They're more concerned now, and appropriately so. And that will then follow through with policy and so on. So, new answer.
And if I could follow up,
that's
the increase in business I'm seeing, I agree with Joanne. I'm not seeing it as related to the pandemic. I would attribute it more to there has been greater awareness of this program, and people looked and saw what happened in the last round, the CAF Phase 2 auction. And so I'm attributing it more to that than the pandemic, that there's more awareness and education and just greater interest amongst a broader number of entities than before.
Somebody sent a special shout out to Joanne that COVID-19 has exposed some broadband affordability gaps in our city. No surprise. Oh, must be one of your clients, Joanne. Lucky you. We want to apply for funds for Fiber Hoods planning a grant. I think the staff are looking to EDA. What other resources could you recommend besides EDA grant?
So if you are a city, there's some unfortunately bad news for you. EDA may be your best shot. And the reason for that is that the EDA funding is not rural broadband funding. It's not broadband funding at all. It's economic development funding. So if you're in a city, you're eligible, whereas RDOF and the other programs that are explicitly for broadband are almost universally going or directed only to the most rural areas that are entirely unserved. If you are in a city, you are generally considered served by the FCC, and so there aren't a lot of other programs. What I would do in your circumstances, and I don't know what city you are or what your circumstances are, but I would generally think about the EDA funding as a very strong starting point. I would think about outreach to philanthropy. I would think about whether there are state programs that are less restrictive than the federal programs, broadband funding programs. And then I think about other kinds of economic development programs and incentive opportunities that you can use, traditional economic development programs you use to attract companies to build other kinds of things in your community, to locate jobs in your community and so on. And can you use those in a broadband context, and how can you use them? Finally, one last thought is that there is CARES Act money that flowed to school districts to address the enormous challenges with getting students connected who needed to distance learn. Some of that funding has gone into infrastructure. Some of the more visionary school districts are thinking about how do we build an infrastructure solution so we solve this problem for the long term, rather than using this money to provide services for 3 months or 6 months, and at the end of that time period, we're back where we started. You may want to coordinate with your school districts and see what they are doing. And the other pot of money from the CARES Act that is also being used carefully and selectively in some places for infrastructure is the funding that went in big blocks to the states, some of which then went from the states down to the localities. I have spoken to many states and localities over the past month who are planning to use their CARES Act funding, which was just intended for COVID-19 recovery. They were allowed to use it for anything so long as in that framework and spent by the end of the year, but they are targeting it toward broadband infrastructure projects. So if you align around those things with other members of your government, you may have access to different pots of funding that can be layered on top of each other.
Good. I didn't ask either of you to address the mapping issue because it is such a big issue on top of funding, but how can entities that are looking to apply for funding under any of the programs you both discussed overcome its deficiency and avoid bogus challenges due to poor mapping information? And Carol, I'll ask you that first because we anticipate a lot of challenges in the RDOF funding.
Well, there were a lot of challenges filed, but I will say the FCC's tactic has been to focus on the areas that, at least based on its own data, are entirely unserved. So the FCC will freely admit that the areas that are reported as, quote, served may be partially served, which by definition means they're partially unserved. And so what the FCC did in phase one was basically say, we're going to target the money to the areas that nobody says they serve. Now, due to the time lag in the collection of the data, they basically gave an opportunity for folks to come in and say, well, maybe I didn't serve it, back in December of 2018 or whatever the date was, but, I serve it now. And those are the challenges that the FCC have to resolve. I will say from personal experience, having worked on challenges, 3 different rounds of challenges in the Connect America Fund, it's extraordinarily difficult to do that. And really the solution to this is Congress needs to appropriate the funds for the FCC to implement the Data Act. I mean, there's no question that's what needs to happen. And that should be the highest priority, to get Congress to appropriate money so the FCC actually can fix the maps.
Joanne, what are you seeing?
Well, one of the reasons why I think so highly of the work that USDA, the Rural Utility Service that USDA has done in making grants over the years, including the last couple of years with the Reconnect program, is because they don't rely on the FCC's data. I think they are less trusting of the FCC's data than most, and knowingly so, because they're actually very, appropriately so, they're very knowledgeable about the true state of rural broadband. And quite honestly, it's just really hard to make good policy or to give out money well when you are doing it based on bad data. Carol's point is right, that if you feel confident that at least this bare minimum is unserved, then maybe the FCC is targeting the money to the right locations, but it's a lot of money, and there are a lot of places that are unserved that are not showing up as unserved on the FCC's map. I've worked in broadband my whole career. All I can say is I just hope that in other fields that I don't know as well, we as a nation are not making policy based on data that is as bad as we do in broadband, because that's a terrible way to do anything. And just one last thought on USDA. What they do is they allow you, as I said before, to draw the boundaries of what you're going to serve based on what you know is served and what is not served. And then they go out and they do field surveys before they award a grant to make sure that it is actually the case. And they're very rigorous in those field surveys. You can't make it up. It can't get it wrong. If it is served, they will find that out and they will not make that grant. But if it's not served, they will verify that as well. One final thought is that there is a non-specific mechanism built into the Reconnect program that allows entities other than, so RDOF, they allow challenges. A company can say, well, you're showing it as unserved. Actually, we serve it, so therefore it should not be eligible for funding. But the opposite is not available, right? A state or a community or a locality or a member of the public cannot say, you're showing this as served, but it's really unserved and it's unfair. USDA does allow that in a way that the FCC does not. It's not very specific about what the mechanism is, but communities can appeal to USDA and say, your map is showing this, this, and this, or you are showing this as served under your old grant program and you're not making it eligible, but we can show you data that it's actually not served and that your grantee is not in compliance and therefore it should be eligible for this next round of funding. There's a little bit more flexibility and customization. I don't know if that customization is the right word, but there's an ability to actually look at individual cases and make decisions on them that USDA has that is tougher for the FCC, maybe because it's dealing with much, much larger numbers. But I give USDA a lot of credit for getting that right.
So I guess we're coming up on the top of the hour. So I guess the final question I want to ask both of you is, what if you don't win in the RDOF sweepstakes? Is there a mechanism by which an entity can fund a rural deployment on its own or through private money? What do you advise clients that may not be successful in this round? I'll start with Carol because I know she has a lot of expertise in the federal area. What are you telling your clients?
First of all, the RDOF, the FCC has adopted 2 phases. So, the FCC says it intends to do a second RDOF. And I'll be really blunt. I mean, all of this is going to have to wait until, next year and later. There's no question in my mind that there will be future efforts at the FCC toward funding. Regardless of what happens, in the presidential election, I think the issue is too important for the FCC to say, well, we handed out all the money and we're done. And, oh, there's 17 million people based on our bad data. And we all know it's twice as big. They're not going to just throw up their hands and say, we're done. There's going to be too much political pressure to continue moving forward. And that's just the FCC. That's just like one little piece of the puzzle. And as Joanne so beautifully laid out, there's all these other programs. So even if somebody bids and fails to win in RDOF, that shouldn't be a moment of despair. It just means roll up your sleeves and find another source of funding because there are plenty of sources of funding.
Okay, Joanne?
I'll just say I agree 100%.
Okay. Well, I want to thank both of you, and I think Craig is now going to join us to close this out. But again, it's been a great virtual learning session, and particularly thank you to my panelists and thank you to our guests.
What a great discussion. So many wonderful takeaways. As Carol just mentioned, it was wonderful that Joanne brought to light the great number of opportunities for funding out there. And I'm glad that we got to the mapping question, Heather, because that is so vital in this discussion. So thanks so much to everyone for participating today. On behalf of everyone with Broadband Bunch, ETI Software, I'm Craig Corbin. Thanks for letting us be a part of your day. We'll see you next time right here on the Zero Touch Learning Series. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.